Good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone, and welcome to Global Insights, a live interactive panel discussion which sheds light on big issues currently facing policymakers, researchers, and planners worldwide. Global Insights features experts from leading schools of international affairs, including the Balsillie School in Canada, University of Warwick in the UK, American University in the United States, University of Konstanz in Germany, the Institute for Strategic Affairs in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and the Ritsumeikan University in Japan. Today's live stream production is entitled Asia, the West, and the Global Economy, Promise or Crisis. My name is Anne Fitzgerald. I'm the director of the Balsillie School of International Affairs, and I'm delighted to be moderating today's session. A warm welcome to all participants joining us today in the audience. We would invite you to direct any questions you might have through the Q&A function on your Zoom panel towards the end of the session, and we will do our best to channel these questions to the appropriate panelists. Before we begin, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. For those in the audience who are tuning in from outside of Canada today, one of the actions that we take to advance reconciliation between settler and Indigenous communities is to reflect on our relationship with the land and the continuous process of colonization that deeply impacts our work. Acknowledging the land is a process of deliberately naming that this is Indigenous land and that Indigenous peoples have rights to this land. The Balsillie School of International Affairs is situated on the Haldeman Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on either side of the Grand River, which is on the traditional territory of the Attawandaran, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. It is particularly important that we here at the school acknowledge the land upon which we are situated in all that we do, including Global Insights. We are privileged today to host 3 very well-known experts on Asia and the global economy. Amitav Acharya is a distinguished professor and the UNESCO Chair in Transitional Challenges and Governance at the American University in Washington, D.C. He is co-author with Barry Buzan, most recently, of The Making of Global International Relations, Origins and Evolution of International Relations at its Centenary with Cambridge 2019. Fumihito Goto, or Fumi, is from the University of Warwick. He is researching East Asian politics and political economies, varieties of capitalism, and politics of finance. His monograph, Japanese Resistance to American Financial Hegemony, Global versus Domestic Social Norms, was published from Routledge RIPE series in October 2019, while his articles have appeared in Review of International Political Economy and the Pacific Review. John Ravenhill is a professor of political science at the University of Waterloo and the chair of the Political Science Department. Having formerly served as the director of the Balsillie School, John's research focuses on global political economy. Thank you, all of you, for being with us today. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Let's turn to our questions. To begin with, I'd like to address the elephant in the global Zoom room, and that is COVID and its effect on the global economy and international order. So the world is now in the grips of the second wave of the COVID pandemic, and governments throughout the international system are instituting drastic measures such as lockdowns, border controls, and the mandatory shutting down of many businesses, affecting supply chains everywhere. Amitav, can I start with you and ask you, is COVID-19 going to hasten or disrupt the rise of Asia in the global order?
Thank you. Thank you, Anne. My answer is it's going to hasten rather than disrupt. Now, why I say that? One thing that COVID-19 has proven is that what matters is not just power, but also governance efficiency. And if you look at how different parts of the world have performed in handling COVID, Asia has done actually very well. But that's not the only thing. In Asia, countries that are relatively better governed, it's not a question of democracy or authoritarianism, because both have performed well. Both types of regimes have performed well. It's not a question of large or small. We have large country like China has done pretty well after the initial missteps. But we also have small and medium countries that have done very well, including South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, Thailand, and not to mention Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific side. So what COVID-19 has proven is that we have to rethink how we think of rise or fall of nations, and not just look at GDP or size or military strength. It is a governance, it's the efficiency, it's the ability to cope with the transnational challenges, and not just COVID, but also climate change and other types of global dangers. So Asia has done much better than United States in containing the pandemic. Also, economically, I have a feeling that by available indications, that Asia will come out of the recession probably better and faster than some of the Western countries. So because of this, I think Asia's rise will be hastened rather than disrupted by COVID-19.
Thank you very much. Fumi, over to you. How will Asia's supply chains be affected by COVID-19? And how might the US-China relations alter or change the behavior of these supply chains?
Okay, thank you, Anne. Wuhan, the epicenter of COVID-19, is a manufacturing hub in the Chinese economy, and its lockdown disrupted Asian supply chains, particularly those of automotive and machinery industries. Japan and South Korea introduced subsidies to onshore manufacturing and shift of supply chains from China to Southeast Asia. However, I have to point out that during 8 years of the Abe administration, Japan's outstanding amount of foreign direct investment into Southeast Asia has doubled to $230 billion, which far exceeds its direct investment into China at $120 billion. The geographical tensions in the East and South China Seas have been intensified since the early 2000s. In addition to the geopolitical risk, labor wage, and operational costs have been increased rapidly in China. These factors have pushed the non-Chinese companies diversifying international supply chains, which has been often called China Plus One. And this business strategy started long before the outbreak of ongoing pandemic. In addition, the recent US-China trade friction has accelerated this trend. Having said that, given the importance of the enormous Chinese market and high productivity of its manufacturing, shifting supply chains away from China is often counterproductive and costly for multinational enterprises. Thank you.
Thank you very much. John Ravenhill, will the rise of economic nationalism in the face of COVID lead to a reorientation, in your view, of supply chains in the Asia-Pacific region?
Well, thank you, Anne. I very much share the views that Fumi has expressed. I would expect some reorientation of value chains in response to the COVID pandemic, but perhaps less than some people have predicted. Certainly, I think we'll see countries in North America and Western Europe try to build their domestic manufacturing capacities for medical supplies, PPE, etc. And they'll be looking closely at their dependence on imported pharmaceuticals. But beyond this, an important point that has to be emphasized, and it came out in Fumi's remarks, is that value chains are built by private companies. They are shaped in a manner that accommodates a quest for efficiency. In many instances, they can't be changed overnight, even if companies wanted to do so. And often they don't, because of the economic benefits they receive. So the interests of companies and governments don't always coincide. One example from the region: for several decades, governments in Taiwan pushed a look south policy, the most recent incarnation of which was the new southbound policy of 2016. But the effects have been marginal. Taiwanese investors prefer to invest in mainland China for obvious reasons. Now, One footnote on the issue of value chains, we've not discussed the response of Chinese companies to the aggressive disruption of their supply chains pursued by the Trump administration. What we can expect to see, I think, is even greater efforts at technological self-reliance. The most notable example of this recently has been Huawei's announcement of a new semiconductor plant in Shanghai, designed to reduce dependence on US chip manufacturing equipment and software.
Thank you, John. And now in responding to COVID, we're discussing unprecedented times, new beginnings, new governments, certainly to the south of us, new solutions that are needed to tackle this crisis. So after a fractious presidential election in the United States, there are hints of a new beginning in the US. Democratic candidate Joe Biden has recently become the 46th president elect. Now, if we ignore the claims of President Trump, that is. So John, what difference will the election of the Biden administration make to economic and security relations in the Asia-Pacific region?
Well, indeed, I do hope that we can ignore the claims of President Trump. I'm sure that officials in many countries in Asia, like their counterparts elsewhere in the world, breathed a huge sigh of relief when Biden's election was announced. We can expect the Biden administration to follow more consistent foreign policies, I think, to be more supportive of multilateralism and to be more consultative in its relations with others. This will provide opportunities for collaboration with China on important global issues such as climate change and the coronavirus. US allies can certainly expect a more cooperative attitude from Washington. There were reports this morning, in fact, that Biden in his talks with the leaders of Japan and Korea overnight had reaffirmed the US commitment to alliances and had signaled a backing away from Trump's efforts to force these governments to pay more towards the cost of US troops stationed in their countries. On the other hand, it's not in Biden's interest to provide any evidence that he's soft on China. If you look back to the Obama administration, Washington was already pursuing quite aggressive policies, for instance, emphasizing the security dimensions of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and signaling that its intention was to prevent China from writing the rules of the game in the Asia-Pacific. Moreover, many believe that the US retreat from a global role began not with Trump, but with the Obama-Biden administration. So I think there will be essential elements of continuity as well as some significant changes.
Amitav, are academics and experts in the West able to comprehend these profound changes taking place in Asia at the moment? Or are they getting caught up in old narratives and pre-existing mindsets?
Well, that's a difficult question, but I'm glad it comes up. My sense is that they are not. And I say that as someone who has spent a considerable amount of time in both Asia and in the West. So I have worked in Singapore, worked in China full-time, visited Japan and taught there, and Taiwan quite some time, and I'll be spending my next sabbatical year in Taiwan as well. But I've also taught in Canada for a decade, Australian educated, and now in the US. And I can compare. Every time I go to Asia and come back to the West, I also have taught in Britain, by the way. So I feel there are there is a mismatch of narratives and misperception, not misunderstanding, it's simply kind of a mismatch of expectations and narratives, the disjuncture between narratives and understanding. And I'm not talking like my friend Kishore Mahbubani, who thinks Asia is rising and West is decadent. I don't buy that. I'm also not saying the West is deliberately undermining Asia. But I think there is a dismissal and there is a denial. And denial is that Asia's rise, how far it is rising economically and also in other terms. I think there is still a reluctance in the West to accept that Asia is really, the rise of Asia is irreversible. Although I must say that that has changed a fair bit in the last decade or so. There are more and more people in the West in the media and in academia who have accepted the material rights of Asia. But I think there is a denial that Asia can somehow catch up with the West, particularly ideationally, like the good ideas of governance, of development, of security can come from Asia as opposed to Asia borrowing European or Western or American or Canadian ideas for that matter. And that is not changing. And also this is because why this perception or mismatch in the narratives and perceptions is that I think a lot of Western academics or scholars, and I think mostly policymakers, I think academics are actually ahead in this game, I must say. They see Asia is not democratic, Asia is not transparent, Asia has too many conflicts. So how can it actually take up a leadership role in governance and provide ideas for the 21st century? Now that is still there, and that's the old mindset and old narrative that I talk about. So we need to change the ideational aspect of our understanding of Asia. I think more and more people, as I said, are accepting Asia's rights in economic terms, maybe even military terms. But Asia as a provider of ideas of governance and also like in the case of COVID. I mean, as I was saying earlier, COVID proves that Asia has very good ways of governing a pandemic. And that's much better than United States and certainly Europe at certain stages of the pandemic.
Well, Fumi, let's zoom in, into the region to Japan, where you do a lot of research. What, in your view, are the new administration's key economics and foreign policies? And how will the election of Joe Biden in the US affect Japan going forth?
Thank you for your question. Japan's new administration led by Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga continuously places the US-Japan alliance as the cornerstone of their foreign policy and pursues the free and open Indo-Pacific to contain China, keeping step with the US. The destination of Suga's first visit to overseas trip as Prime Minister were Vietnam and Indonesia. This visit demonstrates Japan's strong intention to strengthen its ties with Southeast Asia. Domestically, the Suga administration's near-term top priority is to tackle COVID-19 and restore the economy, just like other countries. COVID-19 has revealed Japan's state of digitalization in government administration, supply chains, and education is seriously lagging behind from other industrialized countries. Suga is going to establish the digital agency which has been responsible for all digital-related policies. Although this initiative needs to overcome resistance from vested interests, it is vital to improve the productivity of connectedness of Japanese society. In terms of the incoming Biden administration, Japan wants strong US leadership in the Asia-Pacific, as it views increasingly assertive China as a threat. Japan has been very interested in the US return to the Trans-Pacific partnership. Thank you.
Thanks very much. John, with increased political stability that we're seeing in Southeast Asia, will this threaten the region's economic progress?
I am concerned about some countries in Southeast Asia, and in particular, I have in mind Malaysia and Thailand, where the political systems appear increasingly fragile. Over time, both of these countries have had real success in promoting economic growth, but they have increasingly faced the challenge of what is often called the middle income trap. On the one hand, they faced increasing competition from lower wage economies for standard technology products. On the other hand, they've lacked the capacity, in large part because of undeveloped educational systems, to move up the value chain into developing their own more sophisticated products. So both Malaysia and Thailand depend heavily on foreign direct investment in manufacturing for their exports. Increasing political instability, I think, may threaten this, even at a time where, as Fumi suggested, some of the countries in Northeast Asia are looking to invest much more in Southeast Asia. So I think much will depend on what happens in the next 12 months at a time when these countries are experiencing economic difficulties.
Amitav, over to you. Looking at the rise of nationalism, protectionism, and authoritarian sentiment, how is the current challenge to the liberal international order reshaping Asia's role in the international system?
Okay. When you say about the rise of protectionism, nationalism, authoritarianism, I just chuckle a bit because Asia never had a shortage of them. So Asia was authoritarian, nationalistic, maybe in a more positive sense, from the very beginning of the post-Second World War period. Of course, the protectionism had changed a bit, but still there is a lot of state-controlled economic development throughout Asia. Having said that, about the liberal international order, this is a kind of a misnomer in some ways. First of all, we don't agree on what to call it. Some people call it liberal international order. Some people call it rules-based order. Some people call it liberal hegemony. And Asia always had a distant and mixed feeling about this LIO. So while many Asian countries bought into the economic aspects of LIO, like free trade or interdependence, economic interdependence, investment, and globalization, they never really bought into the political aspect or elements of liberal order, like democracy and human rights and other things. So there was always a mixed feeling, and Asia, it was never a big deal for Asia. So if the liberal order is declining in the West, I don't think much of Asia cares very much about it. Of course, where it actually impacts things like trade and maybe to some extent institutions, it is, of course, Asia is concerned. But if it is a question of democracy, I mean, how many democracies you have had in Asia? I'm being a little cynical here. So the other thing is that when you look at the liberal order, one has to be also be careful about what's happening in the West. I mean, I think there is a hope and expectation that after Trump, Biden will revive the liberal international order. I think he will do a little bit of that. Probably multilateralism will be revived. Maybe to some extent, trade will be revived. But when it comes to bringing back US influence in shaping world order, which was the foundation of a liberal order. The liberal order was always US-led. And reviving that kind of leadership to at the global arena, I don't think we are going to go back to the pre-Trump era. So for Asia, therefore, it's not a big issue, except in the economic sense. And I think Asia will continue to build its own regional and in regional order with China, but also in relation to, in opposition to China, especially what we see in ASEAN.
Great. So we've looked at the top-down view, or which has looked really primarily at the global political economy. Let's move down to a more localized, specific, or regional focus. Amitav, I'm going to come back to you and ask you, how are, in your view, the Asian regional organizations performing in the current economic and strategic environment compared to those regional organizations in Europe?
I would say at this point, not great, but historically they have done a mixed job. I mean, John, of course, is a big expert on economic institutions in Asia. My focus is on political and security cooperation. But I think there are three issues what is constraining Asian institutions today. First is, of course, the resources. Look at COVID-19. The European Union, after slipping up very badly in the beginning, put together almost €1 trillion, close to €1 trillion, and all kinds of packages for its member countries to rescue and revive the economy. Well, think about ASEAN or APEC. They don't really have that kind of resources. So that's the first thing. Second is the US-China competition. That is undermining the centrality, what we call centrality of ASEAN, as a coalition of relatively weak states to manage Asian regionalism. And as you know, Asian regionalism has been ASEAN-led, but now ASEAN is being sidelined by this escalating US-China competition. And another thing is Asia's own fault, the sovereignty and non-intervention mindset, and which has led to closing of borders and reluctance to really help out each other, especially the COVID-19 is really disappointing compared to SARS 2003, where Asian countries actually stood up and did a very good job in managing the SARS crisis in 2003, but this has not been the case. But I think Asian regionalism will still do okay in terms of economic cooperation. There is a regional comprehensive economic partnership coming up, and who knows, the United States might get into this act, either not RCEP, but the follow-on to TPP under a Biden administration. And I think Asia will probably do better as a regional health kind of cooperation entity, because that's already happening. Chinese tourists are being slowly allowed into places like Thailand. And because of proximity and the equally creditable job Asian countries have done in relatively credible job in managing COVID, we might find that Asia will also do better in terms of addressing pandemics, but that's not happened yet.
Well, let's go a bit deeper into some of these trade partnerships. Fumi, what is the prospect of competing multilateral trade agreements in the Asia-Pacific region, RCEP and TPP, in your view?
Thank you. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, can be regarded as a China-centered regional trade agreement without the US. In contrast, Trans-Partnership and Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, was designed by the Obama administration. TPP didn't include China, but more non-East Asian countries such as Australia, Canada, and Mexico. But the Trump administration moved the US out from TPP. Now, it is reported that the leaders of 15 Asia-Pacific countries plan to sign RCEP this Sunday without India. Japan wanted India to participate as a counterweight to China, but in vain. For some countries, including Japan, Singapore, and Malaysia, economic ties with China are crucial, while they want the US to engage with the Asia as well. The question is whether and when the US returns to TPP. The incoming Biden administration is likely to prioritize first domestic issues such as the unification of American society and restoration of the American economy. In the meantime, the UK and Japan have recently made a free trade agreement, and Japan wants to the UK to participate in TPP. However, the reactivation of TPP does need the return of the US. The Trump administration America First policy has not only divided American society, but also provoked a nationalism in Asia and had a negative impact on the Asian economy. US returning to TPP will be a positive signal to free trade in Asia. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Ravenhill, what difference will the conclusion of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, this RCEP, make to economic relations in East Asia?
Well, thanks, Anne. I find myself in a rather unusual situation of perhaps having more positive things to say about Asian regionalism than my old friend Amitav on this occasion. RCEP, as Fumi has said, will be signed this Sunday. It is a significant agreement, at least in symbolic terms. It's the first time that East Asia, in this instance defined to include Oceania, has formed a region-wide trade agreement. This has been an ambition dating back for 4 decades. The ASEAN and China-led agreement that RCEP is presents an alternative to the TPP. So symbolically, I think it's important, and there are various opportunities there, which we will see how they develop over time. I think the big question is, as you've asked, Anne, how much difference will it make in practice? I mean, this very much remains to be seen. We don't know the full details of the agreement. Some people have suggested that RCEP will be what is often referred to as a staple agreement. That is, it will largely staple together existing agreements among the participants rather than coming up with any significant new commitments. Almost all of the countries already have preferential trade agreements with one another. The exceptions, and they are important here, are Japan and China, and Japan and Korea. There's also a much less significant one. Japan and New Zealand don't have a preferential trade agreement. But these first two are very significant bilateral economic relationships. However, what was regarded as the other big prize for RCEP, an agreement including India, was thwarted when India withdrew from the negotiations a year ago. The way has been left open by the RCEP members for India to join, but that remains very much, I think, a question mark because of protectionist sentiments in the Modi government. Certainly the expectation is that RCEP will be much less ambitious than what is now referred to as the CPTPP. We do know that Japan's tariff elimination on agricultural products will be sharply lower than under the trade pacts that it signed with the European Union and with the 10 other members of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And we do know also that some of the tariff reductions will be phased in over 15 to 20 years, so not likely to have a huge impact tomorrow. I wanted to come back briefly, though, to this question of the US and TPP. I'm very skeptical that the Biden administration will try to rejoin the TPP in the first few years. The Democratic Party is hugely divided over trade issues. And I don't see a situation where Biden is going to be able to impose his will on the party in the same way that Trump turned around the Republican Party's traditional support for free trade. So he's going to be facing criticism from the left if he enters into trade agreements. And I think the priority initially is going to be very much rebuilding the economy at home.
Well, there can be no discussion of international order and the regional balance of economic and political power without discussing the rise of China as the potential power balancer in the international system. Many commentators claim that it is a power that can replace the hegemonic role of the United States as a leader of the liberal economic order, while others believe that China's rise might hint at a fall to come. So John, let me come back to you and ask you, is China's Belt and Road Initiative transforming economic relations in the region? And what might we expect in the future? What's the next phase of this initiative?
We could easily devote a whole session to this topic. It's an extremely ambitious and costly program of developing infrastructure throughout Asia. And of course, it's also self-interested. It provides a market for some of China's industries that have experienced surplus capacity problems. I suspect that the alarm that the initiative has caused in some Western countries is very much overblown. I have my doubts about how effective the Belt and Road Initiative will be as a vehicle for increasing Chinese influence. I think from the perspective of Beijing, there's a real risk here of a backlash against China. We've already seen it in some countries, in Malaysia and in Indonesia, concerns that China is exerting too much influence, that Chinese workers are being brought in, that these are very expensive projects that in some instances may well prove to be white elephants. And we know that in some parts of the region, there's considerable suspicion of China and antagonism towards domestic Chinese communities. And if one looks at what's happened in other parts of the world, China in Africa, for instance, China hasn't always handled relations very well, and this has caused a backlash. So I think it's an important initiative, but I don't think it's a game changer.
Amitav, how are perceptions of China and Asia changing in your view? Is Asia becoming the target of a Chinese Monroe Doctrine?
Thank you. Since we have a little bit more time, as you indicated in the chat, let me just go back to the point that John made about Asian institutions, and I'll link it up with the perceptions of China because they are linked. So John wrote the first big book on APEC, and I actually wrote one of the most durable books on ASEAN. And we are both familiar with Asian regionalism. My pessimism is because of what has happened in the last 4 or 5 years. And both Trump and Xi Jinping have undermined ASEAN-led regionalism. Trump, because of sheer negligence, doesn't care. He has only been to one ASEAN meeting. I have written a PACnet piece just a day before yesterday with the Pacific Forum CSIS, how Biden might reverse the decline of US influence in Asia. But drawing on that, US has not really engaged Asian regionalism, and China has actually, in a sense, Belt and Road, AIIB, which had nothing to do with ASEAN as an institution, have also undermined ASEAN-led institutions, their centrality. Now, if that gets reversed, maybe Asian regionalism will have more space, but I think the space for ASEAN-led institutions has shrunk compared to 5 or 6 years ago. That leads me to the question of regional order and perceptions of China. And I will talk mostly about Southeast Asia because that's the region I know best. Even before COVID-19, perceptions of China in Southeast Asia were turning negative, especially when compared to the 2000s, a decade half ago, when China had this charm offensive in Southeast Asia. And this was actually seen very clearly. This was due to things like South China Sea conflict, even some controversial BRI projects, but also a general fear of China's power, rising power. Very clear indication of that was an opinion poll, what I call the Chinese trust deficit, China's trust deficit. Very clear indication of that was an opinion poll in Singapore before COVID. It actually came out in January 2020, but it was done the year before. And just give you one little statistics here. 53.5%, more than half of the respondents said they see China as a threat to their country's interest and sovereignty. It's not you're making up. It's not this so-called China threat discourse. It's actually, of course, these are elites, but I think I was a fellow of Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, and I think they did a credible job of this opinion poll. And compared to that, the United States was seen as a threat by 21, about half of, less than half of the respondents as a threat to their sovereignty and territorial integrity or interests. And Japan, 5.0%, European Union, 3.5%, and India, 2.5%. So look at the perceptions of China, even before COVID. After COVID, China has done mask diplomacy, vaccine diplomacy, providing all this aid to Southeast Asian countries, as to Africa and other countries too. But I don't think that has really worked because there have been lots of concerns about the quality of Chinese aid, and also still, there are other countries also providing aid. China is not the only country which has done well in the pandemic or has the capacity to provide aid. So, and also, while China is providing aid, pandemic aid or pandemic relief, it's also increasing its military actions in South China Sea, East China Sea, Taiwan Straits, India-China border. So this has really created a perception or increased what is called the trust deficit. I'm not saying this is permanent. China can reverse it. Lately, there's been a lot of activity by Chinese leaders going to Southeast Asia, trying to mitigate the perceived sort of anxiety about China. But I think the United States has a good chance of actually also stepping in and creating a very positive response there. My point is that the Biden administration can reverse the perception of US decline that was already also setting in. Southeast Asians basically thought both the US and China are not doing the very best, behaving in the very best way. But it is easier for US to change that because US is a democracy. It can change its government and they can change its policy. That's one advantage democracies have over authoritarian states. And I think if Biden has a nuanced policy, re-engaging multilateral institutions in Asia, easing up on trade. I agree with John that we don't see U.S. going into a trade agreement so soon, but the United States can do a lot more, and also revitalizing alliances. I think we will see the United States can reverse some of its influence loss under Trump, but China will have a little more difficulty unless it makes significant changes to its territorial policy and military policy in the region.
Thank you so much. For me, what is the current social and economic relationship between Japan and China? And is it trending in a positive or a more volatile direction?
Okay, international and local media tend to highlight the Japanese negative views of China, but this is quite dangerous as most Japanese people don't know both positive and negative aspects of real China. International-minded Japanese business people understand the vital importance of economic ties with China, while some Japanese leaders have close relations with Beijing. Japan planned to invite Xi Jinping to Tokyo earlier this year, but it wasn't realized due to the outbreak of COVID-19. Historically, East Asia had been China-centered hierarchical interstate relations known as the tributary system or Chinese world order. Japan was reluctant to subordinate to imperial China. Even today, people tend to see interstate relations as hierarchical rather than on equal footing. The kind of mentality alongside nationalism makes international relations of East Asia difficult. Despite the geographical tension between Japan and China, the two economies are deeply integrated and actually complementary. For instance, China excels in good use of digital technology and global supply chains, while Japan has been good at less transferable analog technology in, for instance, mechanical, robotics, and optical engineering. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to turn to some of the questions in the audience because I'm getting them from through different feeds. Amitav, can I start with a question for you, please? Could you say a little bit more about prospects for relations between China and India?
Well, I am not really a specialist on China-India relations. Although I was born and brought up in India, but I left when I was 30 years ago. And I've not followed. I know more about Southeast Asia than India. But I think generally this is a real setback because despite all their problems since 1962, they have managed to avoid a military confrontation leading to loss of lives for a long time, partly because of confidence building measures on the border, partly because shared membership in BRICS. India also is a big supporter of AIIB. I think it's the second largest shareholder in Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So they have managed to actually develop a kind of a relationship to avoid this brinkmanship and actual conflict. So what happened in terms of earlier this year, in terms of a direct military confrontation leading to loss of lives on both sides, and we still don't know how many people lost their lives on the Chinese side. This is a huge setback, and that has made Modi and the Indian government, but Indian elite, strategic elite generally, turn against China in a big way. And this is not going to be easy to repair. And this also has cost China. It's in terms of perception, not just in India, but in the region. It fits into this idea of Chinese assertiveness, military assertiveness in the wake of COVID-19, and also wolf warrior diplomacy. And so it has cost China also reputational, has a reputational cost for China, but for India also. And I think the big loser, I think, would be things like BRICS and also the kind of crisis management mechanism India and China had actually fairly successfully developed until now.
Thank you. Question for you, John Ravenhill. Your apprehensions about the ability of the Thai and Malaysian political systems to demonstrate agility seem well placed. What's your view on what might be the existential question should Taiwan be invited to join CPTPP?
Okay. I think that would be regarded as extremely provocative by Beijing at the moment. The world has moved on from 1992, when it was possible for Taiwan and Hong Kong to join APEC together with China, or indeed from 2001, when Taiwan and China joined the WTO pretty much simultaneously. China has been extremely hostile towards Taiwan playing an increased role in international organizations. One's seen this especially in the WHO in recent years. And I don't think that would be a smart move on the part of the Biden administration if it wants to try to establish better foundations for a relationship with China.
Thank you. Fumi, question for you. How essential are trade deals like the TPP for Japan and multilateralism generally for the Japanese economy?
Yeah, I think the Japan one's been, given the, I think the stagnant domestic demand, Japan increasingly need, I think, the freer trade in the Asia Pacific. So in that sense, I think that not just Japan wants RCEP, but also I think the reactivation of TPP. So that's why I think the Japan wants to bring in other countries, including the UK. So I think that, but on the other hand, if really I think the US comes back to the TPP, Japan will have to really more open up their economy. Especially, I think it's not easy in the area of agriculture, especially rice, but also they're going to have to really change their stance towards trade in the field of services and intellectual properties. In these areas, perhaps I think the US is really pressing Japan. So Japan should be really ready for this area. So I think that Japan needs I think the international demand, but I think we're going to have to change the attitude towards international trade. Thank you.
Thank you. Amitav, two questions for you, if I may. One that says, you mentioned that the West is in denial, quote unquote. What will cause Western governments to snap out of this? What more specifically, in your view, are the great new Asian norms or values that the West is denying? And how can the West integrate them and embrace them today so as to awaken from its denial? The second question is China's role reinforcing the international order in terms of multilateralism? Will it turn to challenge it eventually? Over to you.
Okay. On the first question, I don't believe in Asian values. I don't think Asia has a set of values. I never use the term. If I did, I always predict it. But norms are different from values. These are rules, and I don't think you can deny that Asia has been part of generally a pretty cooperative player when it comes to international norms, especially when it comes to norms of trade and norms of multilateral cooperation. But values like communitarianism and authoritarianism and society about the self, they're a completely different issue. So what West might get the West to come out of it? Maybe this crisis, COVID. I mean, to some extent, 2008, 2009 financial crisis, where Asia actually was shielded because they learned from the 1997 Asian financial crisis. And they were better prepared for the next financial crisis, which is 2008 and 9, which started in the US. And the West got into, West performed badly in that 2008-9 crisis. So that's the one. Also, as I pointed out before, when it comes to COVID, Asia's performance, a big reason why Asia is doing better, especially those Asian countries like South Korea and also Singapore and Taiwan doing better, is because they learned from the 2003 SARS crisis, which the West did not, because it didn't affect the West so much. So learning from the past and also performing more creditably will get the West to recognize that Asia has some governance lessons to offer. They are not necessarily democracy, but some of them are democracy. I mean, some countries have done, democratic countries have done very well, in COVID-19. Therefore, that will bring the West out of its shock. Out of its denial. On multilateralism, this is a difficult question because we still don't know how far China will go. China is definitely far more active in multilateral institutions than before. I think it is now leading 4 of the UN agencies, if I'm not mistaken, but these are not really critical agencies in terms of IMF or World Bank in that sense. But China is definitely much more active, but I think China is selective in which multilateral institutions it wants to influence and which it wants to play along with. So when it comes to Human Rights Council, maybe even to some extent WTO and WHO, China wants to change its direction in a way that favors China's interests. But in the rest, it is like in climate change and other things, China is happy to play along with other leaders, including the European Union. So I think I will give China benefit of the doubt. That's the perception in the US that China is trying to capture multilateralism. I think it's a bit overstated.
Thank you. Over to John Ravenhill. Question for you, John. Where is civil society in this discussion? For example, why does labor in the US take a nationalist position and not seek to work toward collective improvements across states and regions? Aside from social movement protests we see in Southeast Asia, is there no room for civil society to drive progressive regional/global collaboration?
Wow, great question, a huge one. Again, I mean, it would be really worthy of a session in itself, I think, to talk about the role of civil society post-COVID. I don't think the statement there is entirely accurate, though, because if one looks historically, civil society groups have been important in the United States in pushing for the US to include labor clauses in trade arrangements. And in particular, they were very important in pushing things through Congress in terms of the agreement with Cambodia and improving conditions in the textile industry in Cambodia. I mean, more broadly, if one looks at civil society groups and value chains, then over the last 2 decades, they've been very important in pushing the large companies like Apple to ensure that working conditions in their supply chains are of a standard that one would expect. So, you know, I think it's probably going a little bit too far to say that civil society has not been visible in this. I fear that the preoccupation over the next few years is going to be very much on rebuilding the US economy. And, you know, not surprisingly, the middle class has done very poorly in the United States. Income inequality has become worse. Unemployment, of course, at the moment is terrible. So it's quite likely that the civil society groups are going to be inward focused. But I certainly hope that these efforts to transform working conditions elsewhere will continue.
Thank you very much. Fumi, question for you. How or in what ways does Japan work to partner with China as it witnesses the decline of US hegemony?
It's a hugely difficult question. Yeah, I think still I think Japan's Japan. I think emphasized its U.S.-Japan alliance has been, I think that it's been top priority in the foreign policy. But on the other hand, I think in the economic area, Japan has to live with China and China-centered, I think the trade or investment and I think the spheres. So in that sense, I think Japan, I think it's important to engage with China. So I think Japan proceeding RCEP is a good idea. I think rather than try to delay RCEP deal. So I think now Japan tries to bring in the US to I think the TPP, and I think they're bringing other actors to TPP. But I think Japan has to really lower its dependence on the US or certain countries, and then try to engage with many countries. And so I think that that's been a very open-minded stance has been quite important for Japan to survive.
Thank you very much. Last question to you, Amitav. The question is, if we look at history and the long-term effects of what we're seeing today, are we witnessing the creation of new norms in the international society that are specifically Asian? And you spoke about norms versus values, or will benefit the East, or norms that will benefit the East. Is international society always going to be liberal, even if it's not Western?
Thank you. I would be a little provocative here and say something that my Canadian audience would not like. The biggest norm that came out of Asia is called human development and human security. But Canadians appropriated it and made it look like it's a Canadian norm. So Mahabubul Haq, I've done a lot of research on this and talked to people. Amartya Sen of India and Mahabubul Haq of Pakistan developed the human development norm, human development index that led to human security. But somehow the discourse was, it was built or developed out of the West, and we have, of course, then External Affairs Minister Axworthy promoting it, which is all fine. But I'm thinking that we don't give enough credit to those norms, and that is a liberal or whatever norm. It's a humane norm. And I think also if you look at, there are bad norms coming of Asia. Asia is still way behind when it comes to human rights and openness, but there are also good norms happening. So in my work on norms, I find that good norms come out of everywhere. Africa was instrumental in responsible sovereignty, which is again something to do with the Canadian championing, then sustainable development comes out of all parts of the world, including civil society and governments. And also, if regionalism, to me, open regionalism is a norm, and John would agree with that. He wrote the definitive book on APEC. Open regionalism as a norm came out of Asia, with, of course, partnership with United States, Australia, and Japan. So let's look at it. This already happened, but we are in denial that somehow we think Asia, because of conflicts, because of authoritarianism, cannot provide governance norms. I think Asia can provide a lot of good governance norms.
Thank you so much. We have policymakers in our audience today, and my last question to all of you is, could you, in 15 seconds, give us your top tip to the policy world or issue for further consideration? John Ravenhill.
Well, my top tip, I think, is hang in there. I mean, at least after a couple of years of complete depression, we have some positive developments, the possibility of a COVID vaccine and a new administration in Washington. So I think there's hope for the multilateral order yet.
Amitav.
Quickly, first, accept the rise of Asia as real and irreversible. No longer right to deny it, or actually correct to deny it. Second, be less China-centric in your analysis. Asia is pretty big and diverse, and not everything is shaped by China. So don't look at Asia from the prism of China, but give different regions and sub-regions their due. Especially, I would advocate Southeast Asia as a big part of this. Third, don't listen only or mainly to mainstream think tanks giving policy advice. There are a lot of wonderful, smaller, more specialized think tanks, and also the academic community. To its credit, I still believe that some of the best work in Asia comes from academia, even though they're written in a language that's not accessible to policymakers. So diversify the sources, and I can go on about this. Talk to a diverse range of people and think tanks and sources. Finally, go for governance and not ideology. Ideology is important, but governance is far more important. Good governance, and that's really where the world will be shaped rather than by ideology.
Thank you so much. Funmi, last one.
Yep. In a pandemic and political economic crisis, the allure of nationalism and intolerance to others may come to the fore. Governments and leaders tend to use nationalism in the name of social unity by excluding foreigners and ethnic minorities. I think all the governments and the leaders have to resist this allure. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all the panelists. That was just a super session today. Privileged to be here with you, and thank you for your vast contributions, fountains of knowledge in all cases. We hope that you will all join us in the audience next week, same time, same link, for our last Global Insights session of the season, when our panelists will discuss how achievable are the Sustainable Development Goals. Until then, take care, thanks so much, and stay safe.